We are back for another episode, and I'm excited because you brought this topic up to me, and it's something that I think has been a really big part of your work. It's been a part of your work ever since Jade Egg Mastery and probably even before, and then recently when we built a protocol, and then even as we've expanded our protocols for the coming Embodied Love University, this is a major part. So tell us a little bit about what is the erotic landscape.
Yes, and we're going to discuss how we're expanding that landscape. So the reason I like the word landscape when I think of it, when I close my eyes, I think erotic landscape, I just see this vast map, and what's right available is like my front yard, backyard, like the immediate area. And then there's across the kind of the street or into the neighbors, and then there's a little bit of forest. And then I go beyond that, there might be a river or an ocean or a mountain, and go beyond that, and there's like the Sahara Desert and just very different climates. So what I like about it is there's this infinite possibility of exploration. It's an invitation, and it is an adventure. And I really want to have this episode kind of evoke the spirit of adventure in all of us, because I think the word erotic for some of us can be scary, and the word exploring the erotic can bring up a lot of like anxiety. So that feeling of being anxious can be transformed into enthusiasm when we look at it more as an adventure.
So you talk about landscape, then you're talking about the different things that could be physical things to explore. They could be things to explore with other people. They could be one's fantasies, mental arousal. It's everything that gives you an erotic charge. That's the landscape.
Yes.
And the landscape particular to that person are the things that they've explored, maybe the things that they're comfortable with.
Exactly.
And then expanding it means where they might be wanting to be curious to test the waters, or maybe even where they have some fear and resistance. So it's really, again, figuring out.
Or even an aversion. Like there could be like a no-go zone.
Precisely. So this is really about discovering one's boundaries, curiosities, and desires in terms of the full menu or buffet of different types of erotic experiences one could have.
And what I love about our combined work, whether it's in some of the courses that we designed together, or actually a lot in bespoke programs, is this confrontation, because people want to feel more turned on, alive, and connected, but there's this confrontation of how I should be, what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And one of the permissions I love to give as we start to explore is like, okay, you have full permission to feel. So erotic for me is this feeling of intense aliveness. So that you're allowed to feel this intensity of aliveness through your system. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't define you. It doesn't make you into something, and you certainly don't have to act on it. So those are the parameters that I really like to hold, because they're possibility parameters, where it's like, oh, I can just think about this. Okay, that's kind of edgy. Or, ooh, maybe I can share it with my partner. That's like even edgier. Or, oh, we're actually going to co-create an experience. Ooh, like,
and actually do it.
Actually do it. I remember this older couple, a very conservative older couple that I knew, surprised me by approaching me and saying, we're thinking of going to a swingers party. Do you have any tips? And I was a little bit taken aback because I had no idea it was in them. But they had just come to a place in their relationship. They're like, why not? And I said, well, here's the thing. You can go and you don't have to do anything. You just observe and just see how you feel, and then you can leave if you want. And that's exactly what they did the first time. And they had so much fun, especially after when they got home, because they were both very like, oh my God, we did that. That was very exciting. And so I think this is what I would love in expanding the erotic landscape episode, is a lot of permission giving, and also help normalize this undefined area of life that has a lot of taboo.
Is that also the reason why you sort of draw out those, what you said at the very beginning about how this does not define you, this does not make you into something? Is it because you found that, I can speak for myself, I found a lot of times the reasons why people don't go into this is because they are afraid of what either society will think of them, what their partner will think of them, and then even more so what they will think of themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And what's really amazing, and we found this so many times when we work with couples who are really in love, they're solid, they're good, but they're just having a little bit of maybe some dullness in their erotic life. It's just, they're like, yeah, we're good. We have sex once or twice a week. It's okay, for about 10 minutes. And we know that there's more available for them. So we kind of like just gently probe a little, and then in that probing of asking questions, you can just see suddenly the access, this erotic landscape they both thought was the same space, but it's not, because how we look at the world individually is very different. And then suddenly you discover that there's an actual erotic match to something they both didn't give themselves permission to have.
Yeah. It's sort of the opposite of my dad's story about how my grandmother would make him asparagus, I think it was, for years, and then later on he was like, I don't really like asparagus, and I was like, well, I hate it too. I only made it because I thought you liked it. So I was making it for you. And he was like, This is sort of the opposite though. It's like a couple's like, oh, I didn't talk about this because I didn't think that you would ever accept this or that you would like it. And you're like, I've been secretly wanting to go ahead and do this myself. We actually match, and I find that actually to happen more often than not.
I think it's so beautiful and very vulnerable. So this topic can bring up a lot of vulnerability. So for those of you listening to this, just take a lot of deep breaths. If you start to feel a little bit slightly on the going towards the triggered side, just squeeze your body, breathe, pause this episode, come back to it. That's really what we're trying to do with this entire Embodied Love Lounge, is to be real about topics, and you're going to move through different sensations as we get real with different topics, because that's the nature of being uneducated, because we just don't discuss these things.
Well, and also too, because normally we associate a fantasy with a very particular act, we never really understand, well, what is the underlying driver, the force or the eros that is generating it, because our mind will have something that is driving, like that has a power in it, of this desire to have some sort of erotic expression, and then we create a scenario that allows that to be expressed. We don't really understand, though, what is that underlying theme. When we can understand that underlying theme, then we can make sure that that theme fits within our relational shared values. Then we also have ways that we help people be able to better communicate it with one another, which comes into intimacy, the shared communication. And then that allows for the couple, with those values intact, communicated well, to find a way to actually experience the pleasure of that. And that can be with oneself or, again, with the partner.
Exactly. And I know for me, the erotic landscape, it also contains healing. So there's fun, there's intensity, there's like, whoa, I'm so aroused, I think I'm just going to blow up from how aroused I am, to like, this is very scary, or this is making me angry, or, there's a lot of different emotions that come with arousal. Arousal elevates our heart rate. It makes things intense. So I remember, because I had the rape experience, let's call it, in my early 20s. There was many years after that, in my own inner erotic mind, a repeated theme of a fantasy theme that would come whenever I would self-pleasure. Not pretty, not nice, not what you would think would be a turn on. But the underlying...
rape of some sort, like in terms of the
It involved people trying to harm me and do things to me without my consent. And it was my mind's way to try and deal with what had happened. And I would orgasm from touching myself and having these fantasies. And then what I started to recognize was that it was my own psyche, my own deep erotic mind, actually trying to heal a glitch in the landscape. Like, this wasn't okay. how do we heal this? And after a certain period of time, those fantasies disappeared. They never came back. And it holds no erotic charge for me now whatsoever. So that's when you know there's also a completion. So for those of you where you have recurring themes or fantasies that are looping and you're feeling a bit weird because they're like, this isn't seemingly healthy, this is weird, or that's okay, because part of the erotic mind, the erotic doesn't have quote unquote morals in the same way that the conscious mind does. It's just the thing that turns you on. So it could be the weirdest thing. I mean, people comment all the time on my feet in our positions videos. Like, so some people just have a foot thing and it's really like exciting for them. So I'm just putting it there that there's a healing component. So the erotic landscape can be explored alone, in your own mind, with your own body, and it's really beautiful when it's also shared.
Well, the other part that I would just add, because when you say this doesn't define you, and I think an important part of this is that, sure, maybe you'll find out this becomes a lifelong turn on for you, but also too, a lot of times things have cycles. Just maybe you had a skateboarding phase when you were a teenager, or a sports phase, or whatever it is, and then you become a mother or a father, and so you have these different sort of roles that one plays out. And I don't mean just role playing in one scene, which we'll get into, that can also be the case.
Super
but
fun.
It could also be that this is just that these things have a cycle to them, and being able to explore them from that sense of, okay, this isn't how it's always going to necessarily be. I can explore it and actually then find, as you mentioned, transformation or relief, or or it just frankly just loses the charge that was there.
Correct, yeah.
Maybe you liked guys with curly hair and green eyes, or at one point,
But I actually did.
or then you have a phase where you like blonde-haired, long-haired surfers. It's just, it changes, and knowing that there is this dynamism to one's erotic landscape and that it matures over time also makes it so much more important to be able to have that shared as a couple, because we have a tendency to idealize that discovery time that's so exciting at the beginning, at the start. But when we can start to continue to explore that discovery throughout the relationship, these are the keys to keeping long-term romance, which most zeitgeist, or the traditional, or I don't know what you can call it, the cultural norms would tell us is impossible for a couple.
Well, we know it's not, because we both know very intimately couples, our parents, your parents, mine, who are really in love and connected still to this day.
Well, and the very few studies that are out there, when I was diving deep into attachment theory for my thesis, there was maybe only like 3 or 4 that talked about long-term romance. And the keys that they continually mentioned in those studies was that there was curiosity, playfulness, and shared hobbies.
Okay. Well, I also wanted to say that it's been my experience with friends, with clients, and also partners, that occasionally in that erotic landscape, there's a facet of your own desire that you don't yet understand, or you don't want to even claim. So I'm just thinking a very particular friend who's married, they're a straight couple, they do not explore outside of their bounds of their marriage, they have a lot of sex, they love each other, they're a great couple. But when having some kind of more intimate conversations just with her, there's a recognition in her that there's this unexpressed side that's bisexual, and she's never ever explored that. So where she can explore it is in that erotic landscape, either just with herself or as a fantasy with her partner, where they're making love and she's like, hey, and she brings in like this imaginary other where they have that. And for him, it's very edgy. It's already almost too much, but it's been a playful way that they could start integrating this unexpressed aspect of herself that may or may never get expressed in the real world, but at least there's an expression of it within the erotic landscape.
Well, and that's such an important part, because when dealing with this with couples, that there's a fantasy that comes up. Maybe it's a next door neighbor, maybe it's to bring in a third person, maybe it's to get dressed up in Furby clothes and have fuzzy
or go somewhere
pets or
exotic
costumes,
or
whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And there's a couple things. So if I were to sort of, when I break it down to clients, I say it's going to be important that before just jumping in, going and having the experience, have a discussion about it. Then have a discussion about it where, such as you were saying with your friends, where you are actually in the height of arousal. And you'll want to probably do that second, because then you'll see in that first discussion is, hey, look, this is what's going on for me. And we can get into this in the numbers area, like the specifics of that.
Yeah.
But just in general, have that discussion with your partner. Have it in an erotically charged space, because you might be surprised that you like it more or even less in that erotically charged space. And then from there, you're really going to better understand, okay, well, what things, and you have a conversation then again after, well, what were the parts that made you curious about it? What were the parts that you were like, heck no, or what were the parts like, I really loved that? Because then you're getting an understanding of a deeper level of how your shared values fit in, or how that fits into your shared values according to where you and your relationship are at, given that particular scenario. And then you'll be able to know better what to do and what not to do.
Yes.
When you then go out and create this scene, you'll know how better to be empathetic with your partner, what kind of things to tell, the other person or whatever the environment is, how you can really make sure that it fits within everything that your partner needs, the environment needs, as well as yourself.
Yeah, and we're not here advocating if you're in a fully committed relationship and you're not open to anything external. We're not advocating that. We're just saying if it is, you are open to that and you want to have that, there is a way to design it where it actually uplifts the relationship. But it's really not us to tell you how to live your life.
I mean, frankly, the only reason we use that as an example is because that's one that typically comes up, and that is an
exactly
edge. But I mean, I remember also where a guy wanted to sniff the butthole of his partner, and it was like, how do we? I was actually working with a company, and this person was writing into the chat to the girl that was handling the social media and chat part, and this went on for weeks and weeks, and eventually I think that they also just wanted to kind of like talk about this erotic fantasy with the chat person, because they didn't dare do it with their own partner. But eventually that they found out is like, okay, no, broach the topic with them. Do you actually even want to? And I think eventually they didn't. They just wanted to let that fantasy live inside themselves, and that was kind of the extent of it.
That's what I wanted to also say. Is, in my experience, a lot of times the fantasy is so much better than the reality, because in the fantasy you're in control of everything.
Yes.
All the elements, the colors, the textures, a person coming or going or whatever. And in real life, you actually need to deal with so many things that are out of your control.
And I think a big one, when you've mentioned to me fantasies, is that you can just turn it off in a second.
Yeah, they're gone now. Be gone. Which is really rude if it was to be a real situation. But I want to talk also, so what's typically thought of as part of the erotic landscape? Erotica would be one.
Yes.
Whether it's audio or written.
Yes.
Porn obviously is a big one that people know about. Parties are more and more known. So play parties, sex parties, all kinds of different ways that people party. Kink is a big one that is also becoming a bit more available and normal. And then your typical threesome, foursome, like combos. I think that's more typically what you're going to hear about.
Well, then you also have people that are maybe, as their hormones change, or they just maybe haven't expressed something when they were younger, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, actually I kind of feel like exploring what my sexuality is.
Yes.
Or and this isn't, it can be sometimes associated with kink, but maybe it's BDSM.
Yes.
That's like wanting to go to a dungeon, or even doing things that are voyeuristic or exhibitionist.
Well, I just want to say a little shout out for dungeons. When they're well curated, I learned a lot. I wasn't going for personal reasons. I was going because I was invited as a speaker. So often I would do presentations at dungeons, and I would walk around, and the ones I was invited to, they were all clean.
Clean as in hygienic?
Hygienic, like it wasn't filthy like a filthy bar or things like that. It was actually very clean. Everybody was in their own self, so respectful in their own thing, and there was all kinds of people, shapes, sizes, and all ways of dressing, but respectful. And the other part that I thought was just so interesting that I don't see in what we'd call like more straight couple behavior is people were willing to come forward and present a possibility of experience and see how it would land, and then there'd be this negotiation back and forth of, oh, well, I'm not open to that, but I'd be open to this, and then they would design an experience, and if they got to that place where they were both agreeing, they would go off and do this thing called a scene, and they would both enjoy or not enjoy or whatever would happen, and then there'd be a little bit of like integration after, and like thank you, and maybe they'd never see each other again, maybe they'd see each other weekly. But I just thought how lovely that they have the SDI conversation right up front, the sexual safety, are you partnered, not partnered, what are your boundaries, what do you want, what don't you want, what's available, what's not available. And it was
having to play all the games of whatever.
Well, there was no shame involved.
Precisely.
There's no shaming. It's like, here are our options. You choose. It's like, all I want is to be spanked because I was naughty. I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be what we do. Right? So, and I actually know someone who went to a dungeon. He had his heart broken badly and he couldn't get over it. And he went to a dungeon and asked this dominatrix just to spank him as hard as she could. And he was just sobbing. And it just took all the heartache out. By the time she was done with all the ice and everything, he's like, I'm good. He was completely over the relationship. So there was a therapeutic side to it too, and I don't think he ever went back for that ever again. But so anyways, just saying that a shout out to some spaces do this very, very well. So if you are curious, just choose a space that does it well, because there's many that do.
I don't know if she's still doing it now, but Dr. Hazel Grace, giving a little shout out to her. She had these incredible, I think they call them play shops. And they had different levels to them of, like, okay, this one here, people are wearing, a certain amount of clothes, or this one here, like, nudity is allowed, or this one here, there's no kind of sex going on. But it's all consenting adults. They all got to know each other, like, at the beginning. And then it was like the little workstations. And in each station, there was a local person who kind of was an expert at whatever it was, maybe some
spanking,
there was like electric stimulation, there was feathers, there was wax play, literally there was a broad spectrum. There was contact play and all these different things, or impact play, and you could just go and observe and then be like, oh, I want to participate in that and try that out. And the person that is sharing this with the community, they got to do this because it's what they love doing and introducing it to people, and those that were interested, either as an exhibitionist or voyeur, just wanting to have that experience, were able to do so. And there was just so much learning that was happening, and then there was food and people would just relax and hang out and talk. But it really normalized the conversation, the reality that all of this is existing inside of us, but gets kind of tucked away in a corner. So anyways, something like that, though, I think is done
that was
really
the
well.
theme behind even very old traditional like tantric pujas, where communities would come together and they would have these little stations where you would rotate, and like with this one you're just going to do some deep breathing with this person. With this one you're going to hand on heart and look into each other's eyes and see what happens. And so it wasn't always explicit, but there was intimate moments that were consensually being shared, and then at the end a lot of like sweets and chai and yummy things and just fun and dancing. But for me, this is an interesting ritual in the erotic landscape that's available. If it's a safe community, you go in, and it allows you to just see like, oh, what is possible. Maybe you don't spend any time looking at another person in the eye for very long, and when you're given permission to do so, it might not even be erotic, but it's something quite profound when you can see and be seen. So I just wanted to introduce those ideas at this part because I want to go a little more deep into some of those. But before going into explicit, would you take us a little bit into some of the ways you work with the client and map out the textures of the erotic mind map, I think is what you call it.
Yes. So if you were to look then at this landscape, then having a bit of a map of understanding that
maps are good.
Yeah,
GPS.
these are the different regions, you know, that the
great pleasure system.
The great pleasure system of one's erotic mind that they fit into can really help one go, okay, this is the driving force, and now I don't have to do leather boots with the person and whipping this other person until they're crying or whatever it is. Maybe that is the thing that's desired, but maybe instead, so for instance, when you mentioned that you'd have these fantasies and you were, yes, working through the rape that had happened before, but what you might have found is, okay, well, I don't like the non-consensual part, but there is an aspect of power.
Yeah, it was power. And because I stood my ground in every single fantasy, that's what would make me orgasm.
Exactly.
They weren't able to take my power. And so I had to work that out because the power had been taken.
Precisely. Yeah. So that's the part that starts to become transformative.
Yeah.
But then once that transformation happens, you might go, okay, actually, well, I do like power, where maybe the person is overpowering me, but it's with someone that I trust.
And adore and want.
And want to have them do that.
Yeah.
Or maybe you find out, actually, what I really like is to be the one asserting my power, and it can change. But again, there's that power dynamic that was there. And a lot of times when the pieces that, it's almost as if, like I think it was Hitler that said the most powerful lies are those that are like 95% truth.
Yes.
And in the same way, some of the most damaging traumas have an aspect that a person actually would under different circumstances like, which then creates this dissonance inside them because now they don't know how to really separate it, and then they start to even question, well, did I create it myself? Do I kind of want that? And so the ability then to find out what these themes are helps one be able to
so
kind of
power is one of them.
So yes, as you might see, power is one of them.
We'll discuss this more, so I want to really go into it explicitly. So
Anticipation.
Okay, just give us a tiny taste of it.
Well, anticipation is, like just before the kiss or just before the touch, or even
a little text like, I'm coming home and coming to get you.
Yeah, exactly. So all these different things, that it's about that part of wanting something before it actually
I
happens.
think that's maybe the one thing that the dating apps do have for people is it works on anticipation, because you're kind of going through, and then you meet someone you're both yeses, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen?
Well, and that's a classic one that you hear typically from a person on the receiving side of pleasure, or a lot of times with women where they're like, oh, it ends up I never get the chance to like truly have that desire built up. And so when most people think of mental arousal, then anticipation is one that kind of comes foremost. So you have power, you have anticipation. Now the other part though of, I think what is nice about, or people will find nice about an app, is that they just go, well, I can just go and have a hookup and I don't have to think about anything else. So there's this spontaneity. Yeah. That's just like, it's the from zero to 100.
Craving an ice cream, I'm just going to go have ice cream.
Yes, exactly. It's like, no, actually what isn't exciting for me isn't the waiting and the anticipation for it, because maybe I've been waiting for this forever.
Or overly planning.
Exactly. It's just, boom, the ice cream's in front of you, and you're like, oh, I didn't even expect that to happen, and here it is.
And now I want it.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's a lot of times people, when they're maybe even like liking porn and stuff, they can just go into, oh, it's genitals, it's highly sexual, it's just right away.
In your face.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Or just the being taken, which is a combination of power and spontaneity. Then you have you have rules. Some people really love rules. And and now the twist to this is some people like to break those rules, and some people like to keep those rules.
What if you like both?
Well, then you can start to play with both. And some people like to be rewarded or punished for breaking, or rewarded or punished for keeping them. So again, this is where you start to look at this. So now that would be exploring within the region of rules. The other ones are the environmental.
Yeah, that's a big one for me.
Well, and this is interesting too, because the more that I've really investigated this too, it can be an external environment as well as an internal environment.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is external environment could be that you like to do this in a particular scene. It's
or nature, or the backseat of a car.
Backseat of a
beautiful
car.
Hotel room.
I mean, for some people, it's just, let's not have sex in the bed. We did it on the couch, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Or it could be the ambiance of a place.
Or we've always done it on the couch. We're doing it in the bed.
Yes, exactly. Or it could be the ambiance. Again, maybe it's music or a certain temperature or candle lights, different things like that. Which then brings us as well to the internal environment. Maybe that fantasy is that it's with somebody that you are deeply in love with. Or that you're completely not in love with.
I have no idea who they are. Don't even know their name.
Complete stranger. So that's what I mean by then the environment. And then the last one is novelty.
So is that taboo?
Novelty?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a taboo, because taboo, that really could be a mixture of whatever your culture deems inappropriate, which could be power, anticipation,
Well, because there's lots of scenes of I don't know, not necessarily the milkman anymore, but you know what I mean? The guy that comes and delivers a package, and you're like, hey, I mean, I almost had that during lockdown with the police officers, because I'd been locked away for so long. I'm like, do you guys want some tea? And they're like, Saida, do not do this. And I was doing it. They were young, they were cute. And I was like, hey.
So it wasn't tea that you were really inviting them in.
No, but you got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. Well, and I mean, I imagine is again that these can be mixtures of things. They were in uniform. They're a police officer. So there's
everything about it's naughty.
Precisely. Yeah. And a lot of times, I'd say the taboo can kind of fall into the rules. No, you're not supposed to just invite this in there. Yeah. And there probably was an element of spontaneity. You probably didn't want to sit and have a long conversation and find out who they were.
Nor was I premeditating this. They just showed up at my door to make sure I was still in my, whatever that is.
Lockdown?
Not the lockdown. You had to quarantine, whatever the period of time you had
handcuff lockdown?
You weren't allowed out.
Quarantine, yes.
And then the fun part with that is they're like, have you been out? I'm like, yes. And you see the alarm in their face because I'm not allowed out.
Oh, yeah,
I'm like, well, you kind of put me in a rough spot. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if I don't do this one action that is mandated.
Yeah, because you had to put
something in the post box, like a test in the post box. But to do that, I have to go out. So I get punished either way. So I was like, well, I'm going to make sure I fulfill this one and risk the punishment of getting caught that I'm out putting this in the mailbox. And they're like, oh, yeah, that isn't good.
So did you want to get punished for breaking the rule, or did you want to get rewarded for keeping it?
I don't know. At that point, I just was happy to share the conundrum that I went through, and then they didn't get mad at me.
You're hearing their brain scramble a little bit. I think you might be flirting a little there.
I was definitely flirting.
Well, but novelty, though, is anything that's new. It's breaking the routine. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that could be that normally you're making out before you have sex, or maybe there's no making out, and all of a sudden now it's like, oh, let's sniff some toes, or let's get a hand massage. I mean, anything that is new. So, and then again, finding the different combinations. And I think this is the important part, as opposed to identifying what type am I. This is a roadmap. Mm-hmm. And I like...
Let's get into the details in a second, because I want to switch over.
But let me just say that it is a roadmap, which means, and this is about the landscape, is that this is part of what you were speaking of, the ability to expand that. Yeah. And this is what we're going to get into in the second part of the podcast, which is how does one really begin to expand this inside themselves, finding all the different ways that they can be mentally aroused. We're also going to be getting into some of the different ways of having physical expansion too, because it's not just a mental thing. The landscape's also a sensorial one. Mm-hmm. And then how does one expand that by potentially sharing and exploring it with a partner? And you will be finding different content that we have inside of our Embodied Love University landscape or life learning, how you can begin to really start to look into all of these things. And they also are part of, I believe it was the Women's Suction Sex course, where we were really looking at women that were saying, hey, I have what's called, mismatch, low desire. And it's like, well, part of the low desire and the mismatched arousal that you're feeling is that the mental side isn't really activated, or that you're not being physically stimulated in the way you like. So let's bring some creativity there.
Yeah. Well, so that because we've been told over and over again by those of you listening to this free side that you don't know that we have a paid explicit side, so we do, and that's what we're going to jump into now. So if you want to hear the how, more graphic stories that we're not really allowed to share publicly, that's what the explicit side is for. So.
And there's also an audio insert where we then do what it is that we're talking about, so you can get a glimpse into what a real life experience would sound like.
Yep. So, see you there.
To join us for the complete and explicit version of the podcast, simply upgrade your membership and gain instant access.